My name's Deborah LaBelle. I'm going to moderate this great panel. I was sort of taken by the last slide on the panel before us that said a policy of safety requires a place to put people. You know, here, when we're talking about prisons, of course, the argument is often safety, but when we're talking about solitary confinement, we mix in the issue of punishment, pure punishment. And the panelists, I think, will talk about what the kind of use of this place to put people, how that results in a great deal of torture, trauma, and the implications of that. I have a great panel here today. We're going to start out with Dolores Canales, who's a social activist extraordinaire. Dolores is the co-founder of California Families Against Solitary Confinement, and that group rose up in response to the 2011 Pelican Bay prisoner strikes in California. She's a 2014 Soros Justice Fellow, and she founded the Family Unity Network, an organization intended to advocate for the families of incarcerated people who are often, along with their incarcerated loved ones, victimized by the issues of mass incarceration and treatment. She's also a member of the Unlock the Box National Steering Committee Against Solitary Confinement, board member of the National Council of Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, and the advisory board member of Californians United for Responsible Budget. I think that's CURB. Her personal experiences of herself being incarcerated for over 20 years and then witnessing her son's participation in the 2011 and 2013 hunger strikes moved her to become involved in the anti-prison organizing movement. I had the pleasure, I think, of seeing you at the Soros Fellow in Detroit doing a bit of a legal moth story that was fantastic. So it's her passion to give back to communities affected by incarceration, and it's great to see you again. So do you want to start out by saying a few words and introducing what I'm going to push play on?
Yes. Thank you all. Thank you so much, Claire and Madeline. You've done an amazing job. You probably can hear me anyways, right? That's why I was always at all the protests without the bullhorn. So I just want to thank you so much. The panels have been amazing, and everything that so many of the panels touched on, Brian Lee, you know, mentioning of the people that we're representing behind the. And so I just am going to open up with this quick 5-minute video to give you an idea of the representation of the humanization of those that sit behind the prison walls. We're sitting in solitary confinement for decades and just sitting in prison in general, because in California, the November 2008 ballot, Proposition 2 was passed, and that was the confinement of chickens. It was an outrage that they did not have the ability to engage in natural behavior. So it was voted on unanimously that we have cage-free chickens now. And the humane standards for cage-free chickens, proper and nutritious diet, comfortable resting places, and the ability to engage in natural behaviors. Some of those were the 5 core demands of the hunger strikers of human beings that has still not been passed to this day. So when I printed that out and I sat before Secretary of Corrections Jeffrey Beard, I said, according to these standards, our prisons would have to be deemed inhumane. Because nowhere in America do we have prisons that you have the ability to engage in natural behavior, and I know because I spent over 20 years of my life in one. So thank you very much, and I'll just open up and introduce some of the families to you.
Inside, unity. Outside, unity. Inside, unity. Outside. All right.
The Short Corridor Collective greets you with a firm embrace of love and solidarity. No matter how often the Department of Corrections repeats the lie that solitary confinement is not used in California, our decades of existence in these concrete tombs, isolated and alone, will stand as a testament to the truth. We need our legislative leaders to take a moral and political stand for human rights and let the Department of Corrections know that torture will not be tolerated here.
we would not even be having these hearings today if it were not for the effort of the prisoners in these hunger strikes, but yet they are being disciplined for their efforts.
I'm not particularly thrilled with the process of solitary confinement. I'd like to hear what the CDCR has to say in regard to the justification for it.
If an inmate believes that they are wrongly validated, they have a process that they go through. And that process is through the 602 grievance process for the inmates.
There's this joke in CDC. It's called 602 it. And it's usually perpetrated by the guards. So if something happens that's unjust, the guards just say, 602 it. It's a joke.
My son once wrote me and said, I have no doubt this place was designed with the sole intention of driving men mad or to suicide. He said, I know because I'm living it. And as a mother, it's a daily struggle to hold on to hope. When you realize that CDC has went on for decades to defend their policies.
The first day of the last hunger strike in July of 2013, there were 30,000 people who knew the truth and refused. Shit.
I know.
All right.
Refused to take food.
The conditions of the SHU? Okay, look. So the SHU is torture, okay? The SHU is a torture chamber. Okay, it doesn't serve. When I walked into California's torture chamber, I was a whole human being. And when I left there, I was deeply fractured. I've been with my partner for over 7 years, and it took 5 years before she could touch me without it hurting my skin.
I know at the core that man is good and everybody is worthy of redemption. I was a life prisoner. I am now the Executive Director of Legal Services for Prisoners with Children, and I have experienced solitary confinement.
I read a few days ago that Pelican Bay SHU is now allowed cake with icing and cinnamon buns. I haven't been fighting this fight for my brother and human rights for the past 2 years for my brother to receive a cupcake.
I have a son that he just went into the SHU. They gave him a 3-year sentence, and it seems like he's like breaking down.
I was going to ask CDC to stay so they can hear our feelings. CDC is not only stealing our life, but they even steal the color of life.
My oldest son did 20 years in Pelican Bay in the SHU. My grandson is currently incarcerated in the SHU.
I want to thank you for giving us hope, because most of the time we don't have any. My husband has been in Pelican Bay SHU for 19 years.
My brother is housed in the security housing unit.
I have a son who is in the SHU. He has been in the SHU for 16 years. My son has never committed a violent crime in his life.
My son is in Tehachapi in solitary confinement.
My son is in a high desert prison, and taking me almost 11 hours to drive over there.
My brother has been in Pelican Bay for 23 years in the SHU, in solitary confinement for 23 years, and I don't know how long more he can take it. He is at the end of his rope.
The guys in Pelican Bay have showed us an example that we should follow in terms of recognizing each other's humanity.
You know, Dolores, thank you for that. I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about framing for the people here, though. how the SHU or the solitary confinement is used across this country, and where we're at now in terms of the abolishment of that kind of treatment.
Well, I always, bring it back in everything that I do to those sitting still in prison, in solitary confinement, and to the family members, because I believe that, through these hunger strikes, it sparks something in the movement against solitary confinement, and where now it is a national movement. It always has been, and there's been so many amazing people on the ground working on this issue, organizing on this issue, and I think that the connection, though, is so important with those personally affected, the family members, the advocates, the lawyers, everybody working together cohesively to get this message out, and the humanization that SHU not only tortures, SHU and prison in general, not only tortures the individual that's sitting in the cages of cement and steel, but the family members. The family members carry this suffering inside. Prior to the hunger strikes, there were so many family members that had been holding that pain in for decades. But it's turning that pain around and shifting it into movement, shifting it into action, making your voice be heard, making those numbers gather to your senators, to your assembly members, and bringing about consistent change across the nation. Because I see it, I live it every day. My son was in solitary confinement for 15 years. He's been out 2 years, and now he just got put back in because under California law, they can still use confidential information to place you in solitary. But the warden reassured me that, that they don't have anything but an informant, and he is working to get him out. So, it just comes along with it. And me being an organizer, I actually knew from the beginning when he was out, I said, keep your heart and your mind guarded, because this is not happily ever after. And, we are dealing with CDC. So I feel that everybody at all times needs to be prepared until it is completely dismantled. Thank you. Okay, now.
We'll come back. I'm sure there'll be a bunch of questions for you about this, but for the moment, Rick, is it Ramish? Yep. Is that correct? He sort of epitomizes the too rare possibility of working with the stakeholders and people who are in charge to address human rights violations and changes within the Department of Corrections. Rick was appointed the executive director of the Colorado Department of Corrections in 2013. And during his short time there as director, he successfully implemented prison reforms in Colorado, resulting in a dramatic reduction of people held in administrative segregation. Some of us call it the SHU, some of us call it, in Michigan, it's called solitary, resulting in less than 1% of the population being held in segregation, and eliminating the use of administrative segregation for people suffering from serious mental illness. Releasing people from ad-seg directly to the community has also been eliminated. He testified on correction matters before the United States Senate subcommittee involving the overuse of SHU or solitary. Rick has also assisted and been a member of the U.S. delegation of the United Nations meetings in Cape Town and Vienna that resulted in rewriting the minimum standards for treatment of prisoners, now known as the Mandela Rules. Prior to joining Colorado Department of Correction, he was head of the Wisconsin Department of Correction, and under his leadership, Wisconsin also built strong reentry initiatives and lowered its prison population for 3 consecutive years in a row. Here to tell us how we spread that message to other states is Rick Rumish.
Thank you. For the law students here, one, it's Saturday morning and I'm really impressed. What I love about this is you're on your way up the mountain, and some in this room, that would be me, are trying to figure out how to get the hell off of it. What was said about what we've done, that's true, but it's no longer true. And it's no longer true because we are the only state in the nation that the absolute maximum period of time that someone can spend in solitary segregation, the whole SHU, whatever you want to call it, is 15 days. There is no administrative segregation. There are no women in segregation. There are no juveniles in segregation. We have ended the practice, and we have done it successfully. And for those of you, I don't know how much you know about, you hear terms SHU and solitary, but to give you a very quick background of what it is, it's living 23 hours a day in a cell the size of a parking space for decades. And to realize what that can do to a person, Dr. Craig Haney, a very noted psychiatrist, has spent his career studying and evaluating those in involuntary isolation. And he did a very interesting study at Pelican Bay, which, understand, Pelican Bay is a maximum security supermax in California that up until recently, if you were a certified gang member, meaning they could prove it, you were a member of a gang, if you got a 40-year sentence, that was 40 years in isolation. And Dr. Haney, what he had done was, it's fascinating research. Over a decade ago, he evaluated and tested those that were in Pelican Bay in isolation. And because they stayed there for so long, a few years ago, he went back and retested and evaluated the same people. And he told me that the degree of loneliness that they had experienced, he has only seen in one other group of people. And when I asked who, he said, terminally ill cancer patients. So that's what isolation is. And if 97% of those that are incarcerated return to the community, and they do, why are we sending people out worse than when they came in? And what I told our people when I got my position, and you have to understand, because you don't know who I am, and you probably don't know much about the Colorado Department of Corrections, I got my job in the worst possible way. My predecessor was assassinated by an individual who had spent, white supremacist gang member, 7 years in solitary confinement with mental health issues, released directly into the community. That's how I got my job. And you want to talk about being driven to change things. What else did I need to drive to change things? And Henry Ford, there's some debate whether this was actually asked of him or not, but he was said, what do the people want? And his response was, faster horses. And the point being is that in my position, you can get all the input you want, but ultimately, you know where you want to go. And I didn't give them faster horses. I told them where we were going to go and what we were going to do and how we were going to do it, and that was the abolishment of solitary confinement. And so for the law students here, from an old guy, I've got two things to tell you. One, there's always another side to the story. You know, I sat up in the back row yesterday and today, because after the panel members talked about the negativity of law enforcement, I've got 40 years in the criminal justice system. And 20 of those years was in law enforcement, and I figured that when things start being thrown at me, it's a lot harder to hit me throwing uphill than it is downhill. So that's why I sat up there. So one is there's always another side to the story. And the other is question everything. You heard, for those of you that were here yesterday, you heard about a public defender who is the head of a public defender's office who bragged about the efficiency of how many cases his public defenders could go through. And then the response was, as a lawyer, do you want to brag about how quickly you get through cases? And then there was talk about a judge that was informing a poor person who couldn't afford to bail themselves out of jail to plead guilty to something she wasn't guilty of so she could get out of jail. Is that what judges are supposed to do? And so I'm going to add to that, because no one said that yesterday, but I'm going to say it now. I have spent 40 years either working for or leading bureaucracies, and I distrust them. I distrust every single one of them. And the reason I do is because things that shouldn't be normal become normal. And let me give you some examples. And I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to think about that as this panel talks. At what time did it become okay to lock someone in a cell for 23 hours a day that's 7 feet by 13 feet for decades? And at what time did it become okay to lock someone in a cell for 23 hours a day that's seriously mentally ill and let the demons chase them around in that cell? And when did it ever become okay to lock someone in a cell the size of a parking spot for decades, for 23 hours a day, and release them directly into the community? What the hell is the matter with us? We've lost sight of our mission, and that's what I told my people, and I told them we were going to change. And let me give you an example of what happened. Can you imagine, it takes two people, two correctional officers, by policy, to take someone out of a solitary cell. So imagine this. You're going to be released. You've spent years by yourself in a cell, 23 hours a day. So the officers get you in street clothes, and then they put you in belly chains, leg chains, handcuffs. They take you out of that cell. The inmate does what I call the inmate shuffle. And I call it the shuffle because with leg chains you can't do a full stride. They take them out of that facility, put them on a public bus, take the chains off, and get off the bus. And if I were the bus driver, I'd stand up, and I'd look at the other passengers, and at the top of my lungs, I would scream, "Run!" That was done and is still being done by the thousands. What the hell is the matter with us? So we changed that in Colorado. We're the only state in the nation that has taken this where we've taken it. And the results, and very quickly, we have 2 facilities that are dedicated to those with mental health issues. Because if you don't know, I'm going to tell you, every prison system in every state in the United States is the largest mental health institution in their state. And that myth about deinstitutionalizing the mentally ill, getting them out of the state hospitals, we didn't deinstitutionalize anything. What they did was they started that walk out of a mental hospital into the state prison system. So over 30% of my offenders have a mental illness. That's what we're dealing with. So anyway, we have 2 mental health institutions, prisons, and I banned solitary confinement at both of them a very short period of time after I started my position. Had a very good sergeant that emailed my deputy and said, "You're going to get someone killed." 6 months later, I had a professor out there from Cornell that was doing a paper, a book actually, on criminal justice reforms and wanted to write about some of the things we were doing, and that sergeant was on duty. Unsolicited, the professor says, well, so with your reforms, have incidences dropped? Sergeant kind of smiled and said, yep. By how much? 80%. And so the overuse of solitary is really for one reason, to run a more efficient institution. I call it the steel door solution. But by using that, you take someone, you throw them in, you shut the door and you walk away, you've at best suspended the problem and probably multiplied it. I'm convinced of that. And our mission is not to run a more efficient institution. That's a noble goal, but our mission is public safety. And that's what we've done in Colorado, is focused on public safety and community safety.
Rich, if you just wouldn't mind for a moment, I mean, in Michigan, we put 13, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds directly in the adult prison, and the minimum time when they're sent to administrative segregation, the minimum time is 30 days. You know, I've had youth write to me to talk about after 15 days that the wind is whispering to them and they can't feel their skin. Yeah. So, you know, what do the Mandela rules tell us in terms of international human rights standards about the use of solitary, and why doesn't the message of the success in some ways of changing the use and diminishing the use of solitary spread to the other states? Well,
there are some changes going on. I mean, my peers, I believe, are the most progressive that I've ever been involved in as far as corrections. Heidi Washington, who runs the Michigan system, being one of them. Admittedly, some are brought kicking and screaming into it, and we've set the bar as far as what can be done and what should be done. The research now is so overwhelming as far as the damage that it does to not just juveniles and pregnant women and you know, people that put pregnant women in solitary. Now you've got another victim. It's called a fetus. And so you know, it's kind of like those "what the hell are we doing" type of moments. But I had the opportunity to talk to some neuroscientists and out of Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh, and they were saying that they have found that involuntary isolation, your brain begins to misfire almost immediately. And they wanted to do a study and asked me if I would help advise them on that. That particular school would not allow, because of licensing, neuroscientists to evaluate or study anybody that was incarcerated. And so they wanted to use rats. And they gave an explanation of how a rat's brain, now they lost me at this point, but how a rat's brain is somehow works with our brains, and so they would get study results. But they also said they had to get special permission to isolate rats, which means rats are treated better than humans. And so with this evidence that's out now, you know, people get into solitary only two ways, which is, I'm going to tell you right now, proves that it doesn't work. They get in there because they are reactive. They do something without thought, which gets a number of people in prison to begin with. They don't think about the consequences, don't care about the consequences. So the consequences don't matter. Or they plan it, they know what the consequences are, and it doesn't matter. So the only thing that is done by putting someone in solitary confinement, other than making them worse, is we feel good. That's not my job. Yeah, I talked to Mr. Woodruff. I don't know if that name means anything to you. He holds the world record of being in solitary confinement, 47 years in Angola. And what he said was that when he's out in open spaces, he gets lost. Because can you imagine for 47 years, the only thing that you can see and touch is your cell, and then having the vision of open spaces, you can't focus. So it's not just mentally, it's physically. And for those, no one in here knows me, I guarantee that, but if you Google me, and this is the one thing I'll say, if you don't think any one of you can change the world, take a look at the op-ed I wrote for the New York Times on my 3 shifts in solitary confinement. And the world exploded. And some say that is ending solitary confinement in the United States. I don't agree with that, but it sure threw a hell of a bucket of gasoline on it. And it started a debate that's going onwards, and I'm going to tell you right now, solitary confinement in the United States is over. It's not over today, but the courts, for the first time, are addressing mentally ill in solitary, juveniles in solitary, pregnant women in solitary, and those that have been in solitary for decades, and they're saying, that's enough. We're done.
Thank you. I think it's a great time to talk, when you mentioned the Angola prisoner, Jackie Samel, in collaboration with Herman Wallace, did a member of the Angola 3, worked to do the subject of an Emmy Award-winning documentary, Herman's House. Jackie's a multidisciplinary artist and prison abolitionist inspired by the lives of everyday people. Her work, in addition to Herman's House, has been successfully anchored at the intersection of activism, education, and art for over a decade, exhibited extensively throughout the United States and Europe. She's been the recipient of multiple residencies and fellowship, including, but I don't have time to say them all, but the Blade of Grass Fellowship, the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation Artist as Activist Fellowship, the Soros Justice Fellowship, the I-Beam Project Fellowship, and her work, including Herman's House, has been in the forefront of the campaign to end solitary confinement in the United States. I want to welcome you, Jackie.
Thank you.
Big fan of your work.
Thank you very much. I really want to commend Claire and Maddie for bringing together this panel, and I hope it really embodies and exemplifies something that one of my elders, Walimu Johnson, said, which is that it takes all the tiny grains of sand to hold back the oceans of oppression. And so here you have an example of 4 different people coming from different perspectives that are addressing the very serious issue of cruel and unusual punishment as it manifests in isolation or through isolation. And so it's a great honor. I mean, Dolores is very well aware of my organizer crush on her, but I'm publicly outing my crush on you, Rick. So thank you very much for your work and your efforts. I also just want to frame that what I have to offer is a gift, because I had the great honor of working with Herman Wallace, who wrongfully spent 41 years in a 6 by 9 cell, a minimum of 23 hours a day, 7 days a week, in the state of Louisiana. And I had the great honor of working with him for 12 years. building his dream home. And through that relationship with Herman and Albert Woodfox and Robert King, my life dramatically shifted, and they are really central to my ability to love the world and to challenge the world. And as my elders, I am infinitely grateful. So when you read my accolades, it's awkward because all of them are really a testament to their strength and tutelage and love. Yeah. You didn't ask me a question, so I don't know if you want me to just keep talking.
I gave you a chance to talk first, but I wish you would explain a little bit more about Herman's House and how art and the work that you're doing can help engage people politically to the resistance movement.
So Herman, I like to tell this story, but I'll try to make it short. I was a graduate student at Stanford University on a full ride to get an MFA in art. And it was the first time in my life that my parents were like, yeah, that's my daughter, yeah, I'm so proud of her. Stanford's real close to San Francisco, that liberal enclave. And a friend of mine was organizing a speaker named Robert King, and Robert King had just wrongfully spent 29 years in solitary confinement in Angola prison in a state called Louisiana. And I happened to have a crush on one of the organizers. And so when he invited me to see this man who spent 29 years in a 6 foot by 9 foot cell for a crime he couldn't have possibly committed in the state of Louisiana, all I heard was, do you want to go? And I was like, yeah, totally, definitely. I had no idea what he was talking about. And in 2001, pre-Michelle Alexander, pre the release of all of these freedom fighters and pre-conversations that Dolores and Rick inspire, nobody really was talking about solitary confinement, ADSEG, the SHU, CCR in the public realm. And so anyway, long story short, I was riding my bicycle down Market Street in San Francisco, and I got cut off by an SUV, and I threw my bike down and pulled my earrings out, and I was like, F you gas-guzzling MF, and just that's good. I edited the whole thing, but I was ready to throw down with a total stranger because I thought they did me wrong, right? That's the environment that I was groomed in. And they just drove away, probably didn't see me, probably didn't hear me, and then I reapplied my makeup, tried to fix my hair, climbed up the stairs of the luggage store gallery and sat in front of a man who wrongfully spent 29 years in a closet. And he wasn't angry. And I was like, shit. I got something to learn from that guy, right? I got something to learn from him. And that learning actually was a lot of unlearning about what makes us valuable, what makes us productive, and ultimately, as you alluded to, what can make us alchemists to inspire each other to be the change that we seek, yeah? And so at the end of Robert King's talk, King was just home about a month and a half. I just said, what can I do? I'm just an artist. I'm just a student. I just have a crush on this guy, and he said, write my comrades, write Herman Wallace, write Albert Woodfox. And I think we're geared or steered or conditioned to have goals. You guys want to put another acronym at the end of your name, right? Because in many ways that makes you important. And that's the way that we're conditioned. That's a goal, right? And there was no goal when King said, it was a starting point, just write my comrades. And I did, and I had no idea what to expect. And what I started to recognize as a feeler was that these men were in cages in this state called Louisiana because of their political orientation, while I was at Stanford University on a full ride with stipend to make art. And that made no sense, yeah? And I think there's incredible value in our ability not only to love but to dream, and that's how I was able as a child to escape my own violence and the challenges of my childhood was through my imagination. And so here I was writing this man who was at that time on his 29th year in solitary confinement. I wasn't even 29 years old. And I realized that if I could gift him the ability to dream, then maybe, he would suffer less. And so I asked him, what kind of house does a man who's lived in a 6-foot by 9-foot cell dream of after spending 29 years in solitary confinement? And I didn't know that it was going to grow wings or that anyone else would care or that this would be interesting to anyone other than Herman Wallace, who was suffering, right? Moving towards the suffering with the skills that I had at the time. And it did, thankfully, and in a lot of ways, spending the next 16 years trying to build the dream house of a Black Panther political prisoner who wrongfully spent 41 years in solitary confinement in Louisiana has inspired many, many other people to do the same. And that is a testament to Herman Wallace's strength and endurance and his ability to love those who have hurt him most, right? And so, yes, there's many, many accolades that go with that and many, many responsibilities, but I've spent the last 16 years of my life trying to build Herman's house. We're closer than ever in the state of Louisiana in New Orleans, which is really, really exciting. And if there's time at the end of the panel, I'd be happy to talk about the ways that y'all could continue Herman's legacy and dream, and the way that we can share these conversations that are not only around our complicity with oppression and arguably the harshest state of oppression as it manifests through solitary confinement, but our ability to share the dreams of how we can and should do better, Because they have to hold the same stage. If we just illustrate what is wrong with the world, then we lose the drive to live in it, yeah? Is that right, Topeka? It is, yeah. Thank you for your drive, yeah, and thank you, Michelle.
So I'm going to take a prerogative and take a little bit more time since we started late from the last panel, and I know people want to ask some questions. But before we go to the audience, I wondered if you all could speak a little bit to it. I'm a litigator, so as a lawyer, when we challenge solitary confinement for youth or for women, we're measuring it against a constitutional standard of cruel and unusual punishment. And so we have a direct mechanism in which we're trying to do change. But I wondered if you would speak to, sometimes, the social activism, you approach it from, do we get people to empathize? Do we talk about moral costs? Do we talk about economic costs? How do we get people engaged in this change? Rich went into a solitary cell. I don't know if it was to experience it for himself or to make a change mechanism for the world. You do Herman's House, you do great activism and trying to get people to understand the pain of the parents. I mean, what are you trying it from get people to understand that just as human beings we shouldn't do this? Is it a shaming mechanism? Are you talking about moral and social costs for the future? What is the platform that you think is most effective in the work you do to get people to say, no, we really have to abolish this?
Excuse me. Well, for us, yes, it is moral social costs, and as Mr. Ramish touched on, people are getting released back into society, but yet the severe deprivation and dehumanization of incarceration in general, what are we doing to the human beings behind these walls? And one thing that I wanted to touch on really quick, when Mr. Ramish said CDC had to prove you were a gang member. In California, that was one of our big outcries. They labeled you gang members or gang associates if you had the book The Soledad Brothers, if you had a picture of a painting of a Black Panther, if you had a ghost or a four-leaf clover or the Aztec war shield. These were some of the things that the one mother that said, I don't know how much more he could take, her brother sat in solitary confinement for 23 years behind a drawing that was in Lowrider magazine that he redrew. So it was used, they called it as preventative measures. So these were some of the issues that we were dealing with. But I definitely think that in dealing with this, The family role is so important in humanizing those behind the walls, and the litigation and the legislation and everything working together. In California, ultimately, it was litigation. It was a lawsuit. 2 prisoners filed it, Todd Ashker and Daddy Troxwell, which Todd Ashker has continued to be retaliated against. To this day, he's sitting in administrative segregation, and they're trying to keep him in isolation for the rest of his life. They said for his own safety. So that's another hurdle that we're up against. These guys, that's why I always make it so important to bring them to the forefront, because some of them are still looking at retaliation inside for their efforts. They were leaders in this movement. They allowed themselves to be named, and I think that that's also very important in these movements that come from within, is having, I know what it takes, revealing your identity. Sometimes they want to have actions inside the prison, but they don't want to reveal their identity. So then you have rumors, you don't know who to go to for answers, you don't know who you say you're representing. Well, these gentlemen in the California State Prison in the 3rd hunger strike, 30,000 human beings were involved from behind the walls not eating. The 3rd hunger strike, there was 100 of them that went on to 60 days. But they named themselves. They signed agreements to end all hostilities. For decades, people had been fighting against each other just because of racial and territorial lines. It was embedded in them that they were to go into this prison and attempt to kill one another, because that's the way that it's always been. And then they realized, sitting in solitary confinement, that they were actually creating their own oppression by going along with exactly the way that it was supposed to be, according to Department of Corrections. And they've come together, and to this day, from that signing of the agreement of ending all hostilities, that has carried on. The races are amongst each other. The territorial boundaries that used to be separated are coming together, and that has carried on. And I believe the settlement agreement in California, through legislation, CDC saw where it was going, but the judges also were given a platform. There had been lawsuits in the past under cruel and unusual punishment. There had been lawsuits in the past that came so close, but yet stopped short. And so this time, because of so much awareness being raised, when I would be at work calling people into my office saying, look, this is a cell in Pelican Bay State Prison. It's windowless. It has no windows. The door is a metal door with dime-sized holes, and you can't see out unless you walk up to the door and close one eye and you look out like that. And when you look out in Pelican Bay from solitary confinement, all you see is a white wall, a white cement wall for decades. I went into the cell that my son used to be in. I laid in that bunk. I looked out the door. I looked at that white wall. I walked their yard. Their yard is a cement floor with 20 feet brick walls, and the sky is partially covered in plexiglass. I went in that yard and I counted the steps, and my foot is only size 6.5. I counted the steps, and I took 26 steps in that wall, in that yard. And then I remember my son told me one time, sometimes I ask myself, Mom, why do I come out here? Because you don't even know you're outside unless you're standing there like this. So that is some of the experience that was brought forth through the legislation, through the hunger strikes, and through all the efforts accumulated together of these conditions. Thank you.
Let's talk about a little bigger picture, because I tend to always veer off the subject, which sometimes I'm invited back to things and sometimes I'm not because of that. But, you know, if I hear, let's think outside the box one more time, I'm going to gag.
I didn't say it, did I?
No, okay. You didn't. We don't need to think outside the box. We need a new box. The criminal justice system sucks. And I can say that because I've spent 40 years of my life, everything from a detective, a sheriff, an assistant DA, an assistant U.S. attorney, running corrections in Wisconsin and running corrections in Colorado. It's broken. Mass incarceration in this country is embarrassing. It's disgusting, it's immoral, it's unethical. I've had the opportunity to visit the Swedish system. Nils Oberg, who is the director, has become a professional friend of mine. He's come over here, and I've been over there, and we've started a correctional officer, parole officer exchange program to tend to get a more global view of corrections. Let me tell you about Sweden. 10.3 million people. Nils has everything. So what we would consider the county jails, the state prisons, the federal prisons, he has it all. Less than 5,000 people incarcerated. I, in Colorado, oversee the state correction system, a little over 5.3 million citizens in Colorado, 20,000 inmates. Now, I tell people I met a lot of Swedes when I was over there, and they were really nice, but they didn't seem nicer than Coloradoans. And when we talk about European corrections versus America corrections, I say this. The now called Mandela rules, and that's a whole different topic, but it was brilliant to call them the Mandela rules. It's the minimum standards, UN standards for the treatment of inmates, what it used to be known as, is based on human rights, period. In America, thanks to lawyers like me and soon to be you, corrections is based on civil rights. And there's a huge difference. And the other thing is that in Europe, they believe in corrections, and in America, we believe in efficiency. And so what's often brought up is, well, the difference between Europe and America is culture. Somehow meaning that their family values are better than American family values. It is culture. But you know what? I'm the culture. People like me. Because there are places in Sweden that are so dangerous that if law enforcement goes into a particular area, they go en masse because it's so dangerous. So the culture is the American culture of incarceration. It's us. We're the ones that cause that. In Norway, if you want to become a correctional officer, you're hired by the government, you go to school, 2 to 3 years paid for by the government before you get into a prison. I just addressed one of my many recruit classes before I came here and said, you got an awful lot to learn in the 4 weeks that we train you, because it's a money issue, it's efficiency. And when I talk about this publicly, and I want this to kind of stick with you, is that I have 20 prisons in Colorado. Not one of them was built to address the people being sent to me. And I am convinced that the prisons in America today, the way they're built, manufacture violence automatically.
Don't you just want to stand up and say, I can hardly contain myself.
And it has to be changed. And when I talk about that, and when I talk about America is based on efficiency, when Nils was over here, he said, can I send some of my union people over? And I said, sure, why? He said, well, we don't have many assaults, but we had a bad one, and my union is now demanding 2-to-1 staffing. But that might not mean much to you. My staffing can be 1 to 125. Efficiency. And when I talk about this publicly, if any of you have ever been in a prison, you're going to know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, I suggest you go through a prison, depending on where your career takes you. But when I talk publicly, as I am to you, I will say, how many of you would buy a home where your toilet is attached to your sink? And you better hope that two people in your home don't want to use both at the same time. Or how would you like to, every time you want to wash your hands, bend over your toilet to do it? It's disgusting. And until America invests in corrections, the problem won't be solved. We're going to continue to mass incarcerate. We're going to continue to have 1 out of 100 people in America in jail or in prison. And it's not going to stop. And I'm too old to fix it, folks, so it's up to you. And this is something that's got to be fixed because it's outrageous and it's immoral. And I'm hardcore law and order. And so I'll tell you right now, no one in the United States has my resume. And that allows me great latitude to talk about everything that's wrong in the criminal justice system. And I do that freely and often because it is completely broken.
So Jackie, maybe you could talk to us about what we can do.
Well, I'm hoping that you guys are picking up little gems from both Dolores and Rick on what you can do. I mean, Rick speaks very poignantly about our desire to be efficient, and I'll call Herman into the room again. And he used to, as he spoke about the American culture, colonized American culture, he used to say, "You can't be dipped in shit and not come out stinking." Right? And when we have contact with a society that is so goal-oriented and the mechanisms for achieving those goals rely on efficiency, we miss the magic, we miss possibility, and we miss the various ways that we can actually affectively change things. And what we do is we create, for all intents and purposes, a system that relegates and relies on binaries to define us, right? And those binaries can be liberal, conservative, or male, female, or right or wrong, guilty and innocent, and we know that they don't work. They're incomplete, right? And they are part of our desire to be more and more efficient. So I think it's actually a radical act to say, I'm not going to rely on efficiency to get from point A to point B, or I'm not going to try to be more efficient, but I'm going to try, my goal is to be more compassionate, or my goal is to be more inclusive, or it's radical to move slower and to take time for yourself. And it allows you to identify the places and spaces where you are complicit in systems. I'm sorry to point to you. Sorry, not sorry, no. The places and spaces where your thoughts, the genesis of your words and your actions are actually participating in oppressive thoughts. And that for me feels really important, is to move at a pace where I realize I'm doing something that is unintentionally exclusive or unkind. And that is an important way that I think we can fundamentally and structurally change. And surround yourselves with folks and ideas and beings that don't smell like shit, right? Like people who are really dreaming and doing, and cross-pollinate. Like, it's amazing to be on this panel right now. And it's amazing to hear Rick, who's gone arguably full circle, or half circle, and really refined language to say prisons in America manufacture violence. That's incredible. Like, we're doing something by being in contact with each other. And so just becoming aware of the times that you're not inviting somebody into your conversation or not strengthening your views by isolating them feels really, really important. Yeah.
So you guys are great. I mean, really, this is a wonderful panel. I'm afraid we're out of time for questions, but I know you guys will be around to ask. And for those of us who are, unless you give me the word that we can ask questions.
It looks like they're running around with the microphones.
One question,
yeah.
I guess. You know, and I think that the mention that everyone sort of relied upon, that, you know, we all, even as lawyers, have to focus on a goal of human rights, which cannot be taken away, no matter your status or your situation, as opposed to civil rights, which we see both in immigration and here it has become more and more fragile in terms of our rights. But we'll take one question.
Oh, I get it. Yay. Hi, thank you very much for your this amazing panel. So I have two kind of related comments, questions. I'll do it really fast. One is you were saying about Herman Wallace and others that they were wrongfully incarcerated for decades in solitary confinement, and I'm kind of thinking about the tension between, you know, who's rightfully incarcerated in solitary confinement. Why does that difference matter? Is there a difference, right? And my question is about, you mentioned regards to deinstitutionalization and what's going on right now in the Colorado correctional facilities, which I think is a nationwide phenomena. And I just want to point that the blaming deinstitutionalization is a very easy thing to do, but is not historically accurate. The people who were institutionalized, majority were women, majority were white. The people who are now in correctional facilities are not. And so it's not like people exited psych facilities and ended up in prisons. I think the issue is much more pervasive. Most of the people that are now in correctional facilities who have mental health issues also experience mental health issues, just like you said, like Dr. Haney says, because they are incarcerated. So to blame psych facilities for that, I think is very simplistic and kind of leads us into the wrong end of thinking about solutions.
I think that's both of us, Rick. You want to go first?
Yeah, you know, when I was in Wisconsin, I was at one of our female facilities, and there was a grandmother, mother, and daughter all doing time for different crimes in the same facility. It can be a cyclical situation, but as part of that, and I'll tell you that my belief is that 99% of women that are incarcerated are there as a direct result of men. And whether it be physical abuse, whether it be drug addiction, whether it be emotional abuse, whether it be drive me to this crime that I'm going to commit and you're going to be held as responsible. But that aside, I happened to ask a warden at that facility, I said, with the proper supervision, how many of these women do you think could be let out? And without blinking an eye, she said, every one of them. And so I think we need to, you know, females being incarcerated over the last decade is up 800%. There's something wrong with us. I mean, these are issues that need to be addressed. And of course, nothing's simplistic. Everything in my world is very complex. But sending someone on a parole revocation back to prison because they're addicted to drugs, does that make sense to anybody here? Does it make sense that in Colorado, when you're put back in prison on a technical parole violation, it's typically for 180 days? So you get in a line you don't get to the front of, even if you want treatment? And I would take any one of you and put you in a closet for 180 days. You're going to lose your job, or you're going to flunk out of school. You're going to lose your home. And your family, if it's dysfunctional, is going to become more dysfunctional. And then at the end of that 180 days, I pat you on the back and say, go out and win this one for the Gipper? Are you kidding me? I mean, these are things that we have to change. Some states are building supermaxes still. I have a fairly new vacant one. If anyone here wants to buy it, it's for sale. You know, these are very, very complex issues.
And if I could just say, thank you for that question. It's very serendipitous. Last night I just called somebody into a similar comment. For me to sort of frame the question, how did this happen? How do you get involved with these things? I have to time travel. And oh my God, I'm so old. 17 years ago, when I met Robert King, it did matter. Innocence did matter. And for a lot of folks, the on-ramp to being able to hold space for those who have been othered by an unjust, racist system of oppression gilded by white supremacy, the on-ramp is actual innocence. I don't think it's necessary. I'm a prison abolitionist. But I also think it's that we have to meet people where they're at, otherwise we further isolate them. And so to create these conversations around alternatives to incarceration, it's been very effective to say, look how many times we got it wrong, you know? And I know that we're out of time, but I just want to say, as many of you know, Herman Wallace was released on October 1st, 2013, after spending 41 years in isolation in the state of Louisiana. He passed on October 4th, 2013, joined the Ancestors, and in the wake of this story, I started another project called the Solitary Gardens, which, for all intensive purposes, work as little tiny Herman's houses, where y'all, whoever wishes to, can grow a garden for somebody who's in solitary confinement, and that garden bed is the same size and blueprint as isolation cells, to illustrate the inhumanity of our prison system. And I have some flyers here if you're interested in doing so. And again, thank you all very much for your time and energy and effort.
Yeah, thank you. Great.